The Last of the Curlews by Fred Bodsworth is a book of fiction, but also a fact, because it follows the story of the very last 2 Eskimo curlews on Earth. It's a book that is shamelessly and deliberately anthropomorphic, but it also interweaves a lot of geography and biology and ecology. I find it almost too difficult to read. I find it very emotional and upsetting, but also deeply glad that it's been written. I don't want to say much more about it because I have 2 really distinguished American guests to discuss it with me. Donald Worcester is an environmental historian and professor emeritus at the universities of Kansas and the Renmin University in China. And Ursula Heise is professor and chair of the Department of English at UCLA. Thank you very much both for joining me for this podcast. So I'm going to start with just an initial question to both of you. Ursula, if you want to go first, is this a classic of American literature?
I don't think it is, because I don't think it has gotten the attention that a classic typically would. A classic is, as a famous literary theorist once said, what is being taught in classes. This is a book that actually did not attract a whole lot of attention, and really only got attention after W.S. Merwin unearthed it again in the 1980s and 1990s. So I think there was a long span between the time it was published and the time it then got some public attention. And I don't think it's well known even today, perhaps unjustifiably so. So I wouldn't call it a classic, though perhaps it should be.
And Donald?
Well, I don't know what a classic is in this case. It certainly was overshadowed in its time. I mean, it appeared in the 1950s. That's 70 years ago. But it was overshadowed by Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, so many other people writing in that era, The Sea Around Us, etc. I knew about the book when I was an undergraduate because I gave a copy of it to my future father-in-law, who was a big hunter, loved to go out duck hunting. I thought he might find it provocative, and he loved it. So it was a classic for him, but I don't know who else paid much attention to it.
It's shamelessly anthropomorphic, isn't it? The characters are these birds, and you feel with them, you're right with them. Do you think that helps the book to be more popular with a wider audience than just a very specifically conservation audience?
So I actually disagree a little bit with your premise. I do think this is a book that is successful at eliciting the reader's empathy, because the progressive journey that the male last curlew undertakes from the Arctic to Argentina and then back again to the Arctic is focalized, as we say in narrative theory, through his eyes. So we see the journey from his eyes, and the book emphasizes again and again the enormous effort that this journey requires, and sort of puts emphasis also on the moments when the curlew is waiting for a mate to arrive. And at the end, of course, we anticipate that it will yet again be after the female curlew is shot. We know that this will likely be once again an unsuccessful wait. So there is something tragic and melancholy about this central character in the book. But there's another tendency that I think really counteracts the anthropomorphism, which is the way in which Bodsworth wanted to emphasize that this is not a human. So again and again, dozens of times throughout the 70 pages, Bodsworth emphasizes that the curlew is just following instinct, that it's just following its genes, what is embedded in its genetic programming. So some people have referred to this as a novel. It's actually very unnovelistic in that respect. The central character has no agency. Let me read you one passage where that's very obvious. It's the beginning of chapter 5. Somewhere in the cosmic interplay of forces generated by the Earth's rotation and magnetic field was a guide to direction to which hidden facets of his brain were delicately tuned. He held direction effortlessly, without conscious effort, an unthinking instinct millenniums old was performing subconsciously a feat beyond the ken of the highest consciousnesses in the animal world. This is very typical. These kinds of formulations recur throughout the book, and that really makes it a very non-anthropomorphic character.
How do you feel about the anthropomorphism or that version of it, Donald? Is it, as a historian looking at it?
Well, by the standards of what went before this book, I would say it's a step away from the old kind of anthropomorphism. It certainly evokes a lot of sympathy, the pathos of this creature caught in its instincts. He makes this point, I agree with Ursula, so many times. That's quite different from what nature writing animal stories, let's say, were a half century earlier, say the first century of the 20th, or the 1900s, early 1900s, when Teddy Roosevelt.
Like Jack London.
Jack London.
Ernest Thompson
Seton. A whole series of writers, Ernest Thompson Seton. They were still, I think, reacting to Darwin to some extent, who had tried to, in some ways, minimize the differences between humans and the rest of nature in psychological and biological terms. And so their stories are full of creatures who do amazing things, who learn, how to survive, who take care of their children like good mothers and fathers. Teddy Roosevelt got very incensed over that and called them nature fakers. He said, these animals are just pure automatons, they're just operating by instinct. They're nothing like us. Of course, he was a big hunter, but but that was his take on it. So I think Bodsworth seems to me to be trying to get rid of that kind of way of thinking about these animals. I think it's a very interesting step away from that, at the same time full of pathos. This is I would agree with Ursula's word tragedy. This is a story about a tragedy. But the flaw is not somehow in the moral character of the bird. The flaw is in that it is so wedded to a certain instinctive behavior that it cannot adapt, it cannot change. The only way it can be saved is if human beings change.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point, because in the human beings in the book are these shadowy menaces in the background almost. We never see them, or we don't understand. All they do is kill in the background, and I find that incredibly menacing to read.
I think an interesting comparison here is the Disney film Bambi from 1942. Where there's also no human characters only, and no human is ever shown on screen. The animals of the forest talk about humans and the way in which they shoot animals, and of course Bambi's mother is killed, and they set fire to the forest. So they're just this shadowy, menacing presence. And here too, you only have that one moment where the farmer on his tractor takes out his gun and shoots the female curlew. But yeah, I agree with Dawn. What this text takes from tragedy is the sense of an overwhelming fate that is arrayed against you, and which the curlew has no tools to defend itself against.
That is even more powerfully underlined by how he intersperses historical accounts of the shooting of the birds, which are shocking to read, really upsetting. The thousands, trailerfuls of birds, and selling them for nothing, and they're just a couple of pence each. And what is Bodsworth trying to say about people? What is he trying to tell the reader?
For me, it parallels a lot of the accounts of the passenger pigeon, which is also mentioned in some of these nonfiction documents that are inserted in excerpt between the fictional chapters. In the middle of the 19th century, people still thought of nature in general, and then these extremely numerous animal species, as an inexhaustible resource.
I picked out one quote for the program. This one is from 1915, the annual report of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And it goes this way: the history of the Eskimo curlew, like that of the passenger pigeon, may simply be another of those ornithological tragedies enacted during the last half of the 19th century, when, because of a wholly unreasonable and uncontrolled slaughter of our North American birds, several species passed from an abundance manifested by flocks of enormous size, to a state of practical or complete annihilation. I mean, that's a quotation from a science journal and so on. It's not Bodsworth's words, but he puts it in here, I think, to constitute a kind of argument all through the book. He doesn't make it in his own text, but he makes it through these excerpts. And it is abundance to annihilation. It just puts a cold chill up my spine when I read it. But I think we need to scrutinize that argument. I think we need to, to say, is that argument altogether adequate to what happened with Curlew? But there are a lot of things that he ignores in making this argument. And there are other explanations for the abundance of these birds that he doesn't get into, which have to do with insect populations on the Great Plains, particularly locust explosions and population booms. We don't know also whether hunting was the decisive issue. Of course, everybody at that point didn't like it, but and thought it was quite horrible. And I think I would be just as horrified as most of them were. But there were other factors going on in terms of change in habitat that have gone on well beyond the hunting era. The hunting did get stopped. It was stopped by federal legislation in the United States and Canada. So a lot did happen that he doesn't take into account.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point that he only highlighted the hunting side of the demise. Well, but Ursula, do you think that that this book, you said it didn't get much recognition at the time, it was only recognised much later. Why do you think that was? Was it because it was a downer on people and they didn't like it?
I think it's hard to tell. It depends on that sometimes depends on the publishers. But I think Don mentioned earlier that there were other books that overshadowed it at the time, such as Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, and then starting in the early 1960s, the concern with environmental pollution that Rachel Carson, but also a lot of others expressed in publications at the time. I think we should also situate this book a little bit in the context of changing discussions about biodiversity, which actually at the time was not yet a term that was used very often. In a really important way, I think environmental discussions around that issue changed in the 60s and then the 70s and 80s in particular, when paleobiologists pointed out that the Earth's history of biodiversity has been punctuated by these mass extinctions. The way in which that really changed environmental discourse starting in the 1970s, starting with then people like Norman Myers and Paul Ehrlich and E.O. Wilson raising the alarm, was not just the vanishing of individual species. I mean, you can get legitimately melancholy about that and feel that something is lost every time a species vanishes, but 99% of species that have existed in the history of biodiversity are extinct. So that in and of itself would not be cause for alarm. What did become cause for alarm was that it's not just the curlew and it's not just the passenger pigeon, but that it's large numbers of species that are going extinct in an evolutionarily and geologically speaking very short amount of time.
Donald, I mean, you've looked at the sort of environmental history of America, and this book comes at a very important time, a very interesting time, as Ursula's just said, as a sort of a dawning of consciousness that there was so many bigger things at play than just us versus nature. I mean, do you see that as a sort of, this book as part of that turning point in our understanding of our place in the environment?
Well, I think we've been making this turn since Darwin, or since the 19th century. It's not easy to periodize this and say suddenly we've discovered, enlightenment in the last few decades. And there has been a pretty substantial shift, I think, in thinking about wildlife within the United States or Canada or Great Britain over the last few decades. And I don't know when it starts, but it's no longer simply a minority of people who say, with Leopold, there's some who like wild things and there's some who do not. That has become much more mainstream, I think, in the sense that we need to do something about these.
Can I change the tack slightly and
Sure.
bring us back to curlews? Do you think curlews, because of the way they look, they're large and they're rather beautiful and they have this beautiful call, do you think they are particularly powerful creatures for this kind of emotional storytelling?
Well, the call, the song of the curlew certainly is an incredible advantage it has. I mean, something that it should be played all over the place. I don't hear it enough, but
Yeah, I agree.
just to look at it, the bill is something I think you've written about this, Mary.
Yeah.
You almost want to take it in your hand and feel this curve. It's a beautiful structure. So I don't know whether the curlew qualifies or not as a possible, what do we call it, charismatic megafauna?
Is it on a par with a panda, Ursula, do you think?
The panda, well, the panda's got just so much charm. But the curlew sound makes a much more gorgeous sound.
It certainly does.
So I think we should be recording this and playing it much, much more often than we do.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really interesting question, Mary, and because I wrote my last book about stories about endangered species, and one of the questions that I was most curious about was, why is it that certain species but not others become a cause for public concern? I mean, there's always scientists or groups of scientists that are concerned about particular mollusks or insects or snails or something, but they usually don't become a matter of public concern. And what my research seemed to show was that for one thing, these stories focus on particular taxa. So almost all of the species threatened with extinction that one or the other human community is invested in are animals. Almost all of them are vertebrates. Rarely, sometimes a tree, sometimes a plant makes it, but very rarely. But by and large, the species that we focus on are animals, are vertebrates, and among the vertebrates, far more often birds and mammals than reptiles, amphibians, or fish. And when you track that down, it tends to be species that in one way or another have a cultural significance, that in some ways human communities can use as tools to think about their own past, about where they are in the present, what their relationship to nature and to other people is, and how they envision their future. And I think that's kind of what I like about this book. The curlew is not a prime candidate for that. That's why I sort of really admire what Bodsworth pulled off here. This is a species that most people, I think, don't know in North America, and it's not a species that most people would be able to tell apart from similar species like the Hudsonian curlew, aka whimbrel. So is to say, well, what about the species that we don't find so charismatic, that we're not so attracted for, that may even be a threat to us, like, certain kinds of mosquitoes that bear malaria? Are we concerned about their conservation? No, we're not. And it is able to tell a really, really riveting story about that species. So that to me is just an amazing feat in terms of sheer writing.
But in a way, I think Bodsworth gave this bird charisma that was unsuspected precisely in its migration.
Yes.
This is an Olympic star.
Yeah.
Among birds. I mean, it's not just the beauty or the song or what it eats along the shore in the tundra, but its flight. And by doing that, he gave us information that most people did not have, had no idea where these birds went, what they went through. There's a passage where the bird is flying over the Atlantic with another species, and the snow, the ice begins to impact their wings, and they fly lower and lower until they're just barely skimming over the waves of this stormy sea. And you think, and they're incredibly exhausted. They've been flying for hours, and they've got to get all the way to Venezuela eventually, and then across South America to Patagonia, thousands and thousands of miles, and then back again. I mean, they hardly get to Patagonia, and this bird is ready to pack his bags and go back to the tundra. I mean, he doesn't spend that much time down there. This is really a superstar. And when you begin to realize what these birds did, I think you either have two reactions. One, this is loony. I mean, how could any bird end up this way? What happened to his, common sense? He could have found some way to make this trip a lot easier and shorter. Or you think, what an incredible feat this bird has achieved each year. And it's heroic in that sense. And it deserves to live just because of what it's been through.
I had that same reaction, Don, that I just thought, okay, well, why are we surprised that this bird went extinct? I mean, this is a crazy journey. This is like the most inefficient and laborious and painful way to procreate into the next generation that you could possibly come up with. So, as Douglas Adams said when he, in his book, Last Chance to See, which is hilarious, it's one of the few funny books about extinction, where he says, about the kakapo, that nocturnal New Zealand parrot that's highly endangered. The question is not why is it endangered? The question is, how did it ever make it this far? And I found myself sort of thinking that a couple of times, even as I was then also awestruck that you could even do that you could fly for, 36 hours without eating or drinking. I mean, another thing that struck me in rereading the book this time was just what a great piece of travel writing it is. I mean, there are incredible landscape descriptions and weather descriptions that are really accomplished in terms of the writing that I found really gripping. It's an amazing piece of writing.
Knowing what we know, knowing that in America you've got the long-billed curlew, which is doing really badly in some places. In fact, all curlew species around the world are really suffering too, have gone extinct, the Eskimo and the slender-billed. And so can we bring this book back as a sort of blast from the past to tell us about, will it fit today? Does it fit the 21st century?
Well, it's still in print, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what more you would want to happen to the book. Just staying in print is pretty remarkable. Mm-hmm. And I think the story that it tells that keeps it alive is how amazing this non-human life can be. But this world is so full of amazing things that we do not know. And they're dying, they're disappearing.
But and Ursula, I mean, this is where fiction comes in so powerfully, doesn't it? Because it can really tell that story in a way that you can't or are allowed to in a very scientific approach to extinction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a book of its time in all the ways that we've outlined, even as it's also prescient in other ways. I mean, I think what I would mark as the main distinction now is even when people write about individual species or about groups of species like birds or predators on their way to extinction, usually there is some gesture toward the larger biodiversity crisis. That is not the case here. I think that was simply not on the horizon in 1955. It wasn't Bodsworth's main topic. What has not vanished is the appeal of focusing on individual species and then focusing on individuals within that endangered species. That is a literary strategy, a narrative strategy that still persists in even some of the most recent books that have been written on it. So, I mean, when I got to the end of it, and the male curlew once again waiting in the tundra, hopelessly for a girlfriend to arrive, it's this intensely emotional, pathetic scene where you think he's just going to be waiting forever, and the tears well up in your eyes about this lonely last bird. I mean, we have this cultural obsession with the last of the species. What it reminded me of very much was David Quammen's book, The Song of the Dodo, which is a totally different kind of book. Quammen emphasizes throughout his book that the last of a species is irrelevant, ecologically speaking.
Yeah.
It has no particular significance. What we want to know about is what made a species so scarce and so rare in the first place. What were the factors that drove that then a single case of disease, a single shot from a shotgun, or a storm or a natural disaster can then wipe out the entire species. So he makes that argument. He makes it very eloquently. The last of the species does not matter. And then he launches into a page-long description fictional completely, of the last dodo, whom he imagines as female, whom he imagines just like the curlew here as somebody who hasn't even set eyes on somebody her own species for at least a dozen years. And she's getting older, her digestive system is balky. She can't move as sprightly anymore as she used to. So she's this elderly lady, and her last, her mate was clubbed by a soldier. Her last egg was eaten by a feral pig. So she's the bereaved mother and wife, widow. And then, just on a rainy morning, she squats down beneath one of the black cliffs on Mauritius and then never wakes up. That is extinction, he says.
So it's just a very last question for both of you then. So if by any fluke the Eskimo curlew was discovered in a tiny pocket somewhere and we could bring it back in America's skies once again went black with Eskimo curlews flying on migration, do you think we would allow that to happen, or do you think the whole cycle would start again? What does history tell us about what we'd do about that?
Tells us we can't predict anything, but no, I think we're in a very different position than we were in 1900, 1915 with this bird or any bird. I think we would spend a lot of money internationally on trying to bring back this bird and preserve and protect it. I don't think this sort of what he saw or remember or thought he saw or went through documents to find these mass slaughters on the grasslands of North America would happen again. They would not be legal. They would not be popular with the public, etc. They would be stopped. We have laws, etc. So let's remember what we have achieved and done, and I think we're in a very different position. The problem is that the causes for extinction have become so much more complicated for us, and their habitats are undergoing huge impacts from growing populations and economic development. So we've got to find a way in which, it seems to me, to achieve what he wants us to achieve, which is a rationality towards other species, whatever that means, a moral thinking and a reasoning about their role and our place on this planet. And we haven't done that internationally, but I think generally most of the rest of the world is coming along very much along the same line. We want to save these things. We don't want to see them die.
Ursula?
I would agree with that. I mean, I think there would be great enthusiasm if they could be revived, but it is a complex problem because of the internationalism. I mean, with migrating animals, that is always a huge issue, is that legislation usually, in many cases, only concerns one country or maybe a few countries. And in the case of the European Union, there are some, nature protection measures and wildlife protection measures that apply to the entire EU. But in this case, so we would also have to protect its habitat in Argentina, right? Without that, it doesn't matter what we do up here. So there's also a real need here for political and environmental collaboration across boundaries of nation and language. That is super, super important for this. Then the other question is, how is the habitat that made this enormous migration possible changing? Are there still these crowberries in Labrador that fuel this trip across way out across the Atlantic? Or is that changing?
I certainly find it the most extraordinary book, and as I said at the beginning, almost too painful to read, really, because I'm a sucker for this emotional stuff, but it really works on me, and so I hope it's really more widely read. And what I'd like to say is I hope that is the very last of the curlew book we ever have to write, but let's just do everything we can to make sure that is the very last chronicle of extinction. But thank you ever so much for joining me. I just found it fascinating, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you, and
thank you, Mary.
Look after your curlews over there.